My name is Alex Sterling, and I used to be a journalist. That feels like a lifetime ago. I used to chase stories. Now, I feel like a story is chasing me. This all began, as most things in my line of work did, with an email. It arrived on a Tuesday in the late fall of 2019. The subject line was just a string of numbers, and the body was empty except for a single, encrypted file. I got stuff like this all the time: crank theories, blurry UFO photos, supposed government insiders who turned out to be lonely people with too much time on their hands. I was a professional skeptic, a debunker by trade. My beat was the fringe, the weird, the stories that lived in the dark corners of the internet. I'd write articles that would get a lot of clicks, a lot of angry comments, and then be forgotten by the next news cycle. It was a living. I almost deleted it, but something about the encryption was different. It was old, military grade, but from a bygone era. Curious, I ran it through a few programs, and after about an hour, a single text file bloomed onto my screen. It contained just two things: a set of geographic coordinates pointing to a desolate patch of forest in rural Oregon, and a single, cryptic sentence: "The architect is dying. The foundation is cracking. Come alone, or don't come at all." It was dramatic, sure, but the architect, that word snagged on a thread in the back of my mind. I spent the next 2 days digging through my own archives, a digital graveyard of abandoned articles and half-forgotten leads. And then I found it. A file from years ago. A folder labeled Sleep Kremlin. It was my personal research into one of the internet's most infamous urban legends, the Russian sleep experiment. You've probably heard of it. The story is always the same. Late 1940s. Soviet researchers, 5 political prisoners, an experimental stimulant gas to eradicate the need for sleep. 30 days in a sealed chamber. It's a campfire story. A piece of creepypasta perfection. The tale always details the prisoners' descent into madness, their pleas to keep the gas on, the horrific physical mutations, the cannibalism, the final, chilling utterance from a flayed subject strapped to a table: "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night." It was fiction. It had to be. Multiple sources had debunked it over the years. But in my research, I'd found whispers, faint echoes in declassified intelligence briefs from the Cold War, vague references to a Soviet project codenamed Architect, the Architect, a project involved with endurance enhancement and psychological warfare. The official story was that it was a failure and was dismantled. But the whispers never completely died. This email, the coordinates, it felt different. It felt like a hook finally catching after years of being dragged through empty water. Against my better judgment, I booked a flight. The drive from Portland was a long, slow descent into isolation. The city's hipster-clogged streets gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to farmland, and finally, to the deep, oppressive green of the Pacific Northwest wilderness. The road narrowed, the asphalt cracking and surrendering to weeds. My rental car's radio lost its signal, replaced by a soft, whispering static that seemed to match the whisper of the pine trees crowding the road. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. It was the kind of profound silence that feels heavier than sound. The GPS finally declared, "You have arrived," in front of a rusted, chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A faded, barely legible sign in Russian and English read, "Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted." There was no house in sight, just a muddy, overgrown track leading deeper into the woods. This was the first moment I felt it. A cold, prickly sensation on the back of my neck. The feeling of being watched. I scanned the tree line. A dense wall of shadow and bark. Nothing. Just the wind. "It's just your imagination, Alex," I told myself. A mantra I'd use a lot over the next few days. You're a journalist, not a character in a horror movie. I parked the car, grabbed my go bag with a recorder and a camera, and slipped through a gap in the fence. The mud sucked at my boots as I followed the track. The forest was eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of squirrels, just the sound of my own breathing and the squelch of my feet. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. After a 10-minute walk, I saw it. The house wasn't just a house, it was a bunker. A low, squat structure made of stained concrete, half swallowed by the earth and overgrown with moss. The windows were small, barred, and covered from the inside with what looked like aluminum foil. A single, heavy steel door was the only entrance, studded with at least 5 different locks. A small, battery-powered camera blinked its red eye at me from above the doorframe. I stood there for a full minute, my hand hovering over the cold steel. This was the point of no return. The skeptic in me was screaming that this was an elaborate hoax, that I was about to walk into a trap set by some internet troll with too much time and money. But the journalist, the fool who'd flown 1,000 miles on a hunch, had to know. I knocked. The sound was dead, swallowed by the thick door. I waited. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time. A series of metallic clunks echoed from within, one after the other. As the locks were undone, the door groaned open a few inches, revealing a sliver of darkness and a single, pale blue eye, webbed with red veins. "You are the writer," a voice rasped, thick with a Russian accent. It sounded like gravel being dragged over concrete. "I am," I said, my own voice sounding thin. "I got your email." The eye studied me for a long moment. "You came alone?" "Yes." Another series of clunks, and the door opened fully. The man standing there was a ghost. He was ancient, impossibly thin. His skin stretched like parchment over a bird-like skeleton. He wore a stained, threadbare cardigan and leaned heavily on a metal cane. The air that wafted out of the house was stale, smelling of dust, old paper, and something else, something faintly antiseptic, like a long-abandoned hospital. "I am Dmitri. Come in," he said, turning and shuffling into the gloom. "And lock the door behind you." I did as I was told, the heavy thud of the locks echoing in the small space. The inside of the house was a hoarder's nightmare of paranoia. Books and papers were stacked to the ceiling. Wires ran along the floorboards, connected to a mishmash of old and new security equipment. The foil-covered windows cast the entire place in a strange, twilight glow. Dmitri collapsed into a worn armchair next to a table cluttered with pill bottles and a half-empty glass of water. He gestured for me to take the only other chair, a simple wooden one. "You wish to know about Project Architect," he said. It wasn't a question. "I wish to know the truth," I replied, setting my recorder on the table between us. He didn't object. He let out a dry, rattling cough that shook his entire frame. "Truth," he scoffed softly. "Truth is a luxury. We were not in the business of luxury. We were in the business of necessity. The motherland had enemies, inside and out. We needed an advantage, an army that did not need to rest, a workforce that did not tire. We thought sleep was a weakness, an evolutionary flaw to be corrected." His eyes seemed to unfocus, looking past me, into a memory half a century old. I was a young man then, a patriot, a chemist. I helped design the gas, Nikolaev gas, we called it, a complex stimulant that inhibited the brain's sleep-regulating functions on a chemical level. It was supposed to be a miracle. He paused, taking a shaky sip of water. I didn't speak. I just let the silence hang. Let him gather his thoughts. The initial trials were promising. Animals stayed awake for days, weeks. They became more aggressive, yes, but they were manageable. So, we moved to human subjects. Political prisoners, men deemed enemies of the state. Their lives were forfeit anyway. 5 of them, healthy, strong men. We told them they would be freed if they cooperated for 30 days. He closed his eyes. We put them in a sealed chamber. We had microphones, one-way glass, and a steady supply of food, water, and books. And, of course, the gas, mixed into the ventilated air in trace amounts. This was it, the story, the myth I'd chased for years, being told to me by a man who claimed to have been there. My heart hammered against my ribs. For the first 3 days, Dmitri continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It was calm. The subjects were promised freedom, so they were cooperative. They spoke to each other. Read the books. They avoided sleeping, as instructed. By day 5, the cracks began to show. Their conversations became darker. They spoke of past traumas, of the things that had led them there. They became paranoid, whispering to themselves, refusing to speak to each other, instead murmuring into the microphones. trying to win our favor by betraying their comrades. He gestured a trembling hand towards a stack of dusty, leather-bound journals on a nearby shelf. I kept a log, every day. On the 9th day, the screaming started. One of them, the youngest, ran back and forth across the length of the chamber for 3 hours straight, screaming until his voice was raw. When he could scream no more, he only whimpered. The others did not react. They continued to whisper into the microphones. Then, a second one started screaming. The other two who weren't screaming took the books, smeared them with their own feces, and plastered the pages over the one-way glass, sealing us off from them. The screaming stopped, and then, silence. I could feel the hairs on my arms standing up. The room felt colder. For 3 days, there was nothing, Dmitri said, his voice strained. We checked the microphones. They were working. We checked the oxygen levels. They were normal. They were consuming food, so we knew they were alive. But there was absolute silence. We, the researchers, began to argue. The military command wanted to see results. They threatened to open the chamber. But we were afraid of what we would find. On the 15th day, we decided we had to intervene. We announced over the intercom, "We are opening the chamber. Lie flat on the floor and do not resist. Compliance will earn one of you immediate freedom." To our surprise, a calm voice answered, a voice we had not heard in days. It said, "We no longer want to be freed." Dmitri's breath hitched. We flushed the chamber of the gas and filled it with fresh air. The subjects began to scream as if in agony. 3 distinct voices, pleading, begging for us to turn the gas back on. We opened the door. The sight, Bozhe moi, God help me, the sight. He had to stop, his body trembling. I waited, my own throat tight. The food for the past 5 days hadn't been touched. But, there was flesh missing. From the corpse of the first subject who had started screaming. And from the others, chunks of muscle and skin had been ripped from their own bodies. From their thighs, their arms, their chests. We could see their ribs through the holes in their sides. Their organs, but they were alive. Their digestive systems were working. We discovered later, they had been digesting their own flesh. They were not just subjects anymore. They were self-sustaining organisms. My stomach churned. This was far more graphic, more visceral than the internet version. They fought the soldiers who tried to remove them, fought with a strength we could not comprehend. One had his spleen ruptured and bled out, but he fought for 3 minutes, screaming, more gas, until his heart stopped. The 4 survivors were restrained and taken to a medical facility. The one with the most severe injuries, the one who had torn out his own organs, he was taken to surgery. As they tried to sedate him, he fought with such force he tore a muscle in his arm. The doctor was shocked. He said he had never seen anything like it. The subject just smiled. Dmitri looked me straight in the eye, and for the first time, I saw not just age, but pure, undiluted terror. The nurse asked him why he was smiling. He looked at her, and he said, "I must remain awake." We tried to operate, but anesthetics had no effect on him. We had to use massive doses, 10 times the human limit. His eyelids would flutter, and then snap open. He tore through the leather restraints, thick as a man's belt. A soldier held him down, and he turned his head and tore out the soldier's throat with his teeth. He bled out, but his last words were a gurgled, "Keep cutting?" Suddenly, from outside the house, there was a sound, a sharp snap. I jumped, my head whipping towards the door. Dmitri didn't flinch. His eyes were locked on mine. "What was that?" I whispered. "The forest is old," he said, his voice flat. "Branches fall." But it didn't sound like a branch. It sounded like a footstep. A heavy one, snapping a dry twig. I strained my ears, listening. There was only the low hum of Dmitri's equipment and the frantic pounding of my own heart. "It's just a deer," I told myself. "You're in the middle of nowhere." "Of course. There are animals." "The other 3, I prompted, trying to pull my focus back to the story, away from the oppressive woods outside. "The other 3 were secured in the same facility," Dmitri said, his gaze drifting back to the past. "We put them back on the Nikolaev gas. At their demand, we wanted to study them, to understand what they had become. Their wounds didn't seem to bother them. They would pace and watch us through the one-way glass. Their requests were simple: more gas. Their minds were gone. And yet, they were lucid. They spoke of things, military strategies, weak points in our own command structure, things they could not possibly know. It was as if their consciousness, freed from the cycle of sleep and dreams, had expanded. They could see patterns in the world that we couldn't. One day, the commander, a man of little imagination, wanted to know what they were. He sent a researcher in to ask them. The two who were still able to speak, they just smiled. The third one, who had his vocal cords torn out, he just watched. The first one said, "Have you forgotten so easily? We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all." The second one added, "We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal world where we cannot tread." The words, the exact words from the legend. Hearing them from this old, dying man in a concrete box in the Oregon woods sent a wave of icy dread through me. This wasn't a story. This was a testimony. The researcher fled. Dmitri whispered. He shot himself in his office that night. The project was deemed a catastrophic failure. The command ordered the subjects terminated. And the facility, the research, all of us, erased. He leaned forward, his voice barely audible. They took them off the gas. They expected them to die. But they didn't. They convulsed. And then, they fell silent. The EKG monitors showed a flat line. For a moment, we thought it was over. But then, one of the nurses screamed. The brainwave monitors, they were not flat. They showed brief, repeated moments of brain activity. The same moments that occur just before death. They were trapped, dying, over and over and over again. The commander gave the order. The remaining two were shot. The chamber was welded shut. The facility buried. I was reassigned. My colleagues, they disappeared over the years. Accidents, suicides. I knew they were silencing us. I ran. I came here, to this place, to hide, to wait. He slumped back in his chair, exhausted. The story was over, but something didn't add up. Dmitri, I said softly, you said 5 prisoners went in. 4 died. What happened to the 5th? Dmitri's head snapped up. The terror in his eyes was blinding. It was the look of a man who had lived with a monster under his bed his entire life. He was the quiet one. Dmitri rasped. The one who plastered the windows. The one who watched. During the initial chaos of removing them from the chamber, he was gone. He just vanished. Not a trace. The military searched for weeks. Nothing. They concluded he must have died in the forest. But I knew he was different. The others were insane. Primal. He was intelligent, patient. He didn't need to scream. He just adapted. My blood ran cold. You think he's still alive? Dmitri let out a dry, humorless laugh that turned into another racking cough. Alive? That word doesn't apply. The gas didn't just keep them awake. You see, that was its primary function. But there was a side effect we never anticipated. It unmoored them. Consciousness without the anchor of sleep is a terrible thing. It changes. It evolves. The others, their minds shattered into primal rage. His consolidated. It became something lean, efficient, eternal. He doesn't need to eat. He doesn't need to rest. He just is. A waking nightmare given form. It was at that exact moment that the power went out. The room plunged into absolute blackness. The hum of the equipment died, leaving a silence so complete my ears began to ring. I gasped, fumbling in my bag for my phone, my fingers clumsy with panic. Dmitri? I called out into the dark. No answer. Dmitri. Only the sound of my own ragged breathing. I found my phone, my thumb shaking as I switched on the flashlight. The beam cut a sharp cone through the darkness, landing on the armchair. It was empty. My heart seized in my chest. I swept the light around the room. The stacks of paper, the cluttered shelves, the door, still locked. He couldn't have gotten out. This isn't funny. Dmitri, I yelled, my voice cracking. Then I heard it, a soft, wet, tearing sound. It was coming from the corner of the room, behind a mountain of old newspapers. My hand, holding the phone, was trembling so violently the beam of light danced and jittered. I forced myself to move, my feet shuffling, kicking aside old books. I rounded the stack of papers and pointed the light. Dmitri was on the floor. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. His chest was open. A dark, ragged wound. His old, frail ribcage was cracked and splintered, and the space where his heart should have been was an empty, black cavity. I stumbled back, a strangled cry catching in my throat. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, and the smell, the faint, antiseptic smell I'd noticed earlier, was now overpowering, mixed with the coppery tang of fresh blood. My light beam danced wildly around the room, a frantic spotlight in my personal horror show. The windows, the door, the ceiling, nothing, no one. And then the beam fell on the leather-bound journals on the shelf. The ones Dmitri had pointed to. The top one was open. A page was bookmarked with a brittle, yellowed photograph. My journalistic instincts, buried under a mountain of sheer terror, forced me to look. I picked it up. It was a picture of 5 men in drab, prison-like uniforms, standing against a concrete wall. They were the subjects, young, gaunt, but recognizably human, and on the back, 5 names were written in Cyrillic. My phone started to ring. The sound was so violent, so intrusive in the dead silence, that I screamed and almost dropped it. I looked at the screen. Unknown number. My thumb, acting of its own accord, answered the call. I put the phone to my ear, my whole body shaking. For a few seconds, there was only static, the same soft, whispering static I'd heard in the car. And then a voice spoke. It was calm, perfectly rational, devoid of any emotion. It was a voice that had not been used for a very, very long time, and it spoke in flawless, unaccented English. The architect is dead, the voice said. The foundation is gone. You are the new pillar. The line went dead. I didn't think. I ran. I fumbled with the locks on the steel door, my fingers feeling like fat, useless sausages. 1 lock, then 2, my breath sobbing in my throat. 3, 4. The final lock clicked open and I threw the door wide, bursting out into the cold night air. The moon was full, casting long, skeletal shadows through the trees. I didn't look back. I sprinted down the muddy track, slipping and sliding, my lungs on fire. The woods were no longer silent. I could hear something behind me. It wasn't the sound of running. It was a calm, steady walking pace, the sound of someone who wasn't in a hurry, someone who knew they had all the time in the world. Squelch, squelch, squelch. I risked a glance over my shoulder. In the moonlight, at the edge of the woods, a figure was standing there, tall and impossibly thin, a silhouette against the darkness of the trees. It just stood there, watching me. I scrambled into my rental car, my keys shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I slammed the car into reverse, spitting mud and gravel, and spun it around, my headlights cutting a path through the oppressive darkness. As I sped away, my headlights swept across the edge of the road, and for a fraction of a second, I saw him. He was standing right by the fence. It was a man. He was pale, emaciated, wearing the tattered remains of what looked like a uniform. He had no hair, and his eyes were wide, intelligent, and utterly sleepless. They glowed faintly in the headlights. And he was smiling, a calm, knowing smile. He gave me a small, slow nod, as if in acknowledgement, as if to say, I see you. I screamed and stomped on the accelerator, not looking back again. I drove for hours. I don't know how many. I didn't stop until the sun came up and I found myself at a gas station in a town whose name I didn't know. I was covered in mud, shaking, and probably looked insane. I called the police. I told them everything. The coordinates, the house, Dmitri. A part of me, the old journalist, thought maybe this would be the story of a lifetime. They sent a patrol car out. 2 deputies. They called me back a few hours later. They found the fence. They found the muddy track. But where the house should have been, there was nothing, just a collapsed, overgrown depression in the earth, as if a root cellar had caved in decades ago. There was no concrete, no steel door, no sign that anyone had lived there for a very, very long time. They found my footprints, and the tire tracks from my car. Nothing else. No Dmitri, no blood, no journals. My story didn't hold up. The encrypted email was gone from my servers. The files on Project Architect were corrupted. Nothing but digital noise. There was no proof. They suggested I'd been hallucinating. That I'd gotten lost in the woods and my mind had played tricks on me. They recommended I see a therapist. I lost my job. My friends and family think I had a breakdown. Maybe I did. Maybe Dmitri was a figment of my imagination. A story my brain cobbled together from years of reading conspiracy theories. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. It's been 5 years since that night. I live in a different city now. In a small apartment on a high floor. I don't do well with ground level anymore. I work a dead-end data entry job. I don't write. And I don't sleep. Not really. I doze. For an hour or two at a time. But I can't achieve deep sleep. Every time I start to drift off, I get this jolt, a surge of adrenaline, and my eyes snap open. My doctor calls it hypervigilance. A symptom of PTSD. He gives me pills, but they don't work. They just make the world feel foggy. The real reason I can't sleep is because I'm listening. I'm always listening. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the city is quiet, I hear things. A floorboard creaking in the hallway outside my locked door. A soft whisper on the wind that sounds like my name. I'll check my security camera feed, and there will be nothing there. Just an empty corridor. But the worst part is the feeling. It's the same feeling I had when I first stood outside that fence in Oregon. The cold, prickly sensation of being observed. I feel it now, as I write this. A patient, intelligent presence, watching from somewhere just beyond my perception. It's not hunting me. I don't think it needs to. The phone call, the nod on the side of the road, that was a message. Dmitri was the architect, the man who built the prison. He was the foundation holding the last monster at bay. And now he's gone. The thing from the chamber, the thing that learned to outlast sleep itself, is untethered. You are the new pillar. It said. I didn't understand it then. I think I do now. I'm not its target. I'm its anchor. By knowing its story, by carrying this memory, I've become its connection to the world. I'm the one who keeps it real. I'm its new chamber. And as long as I'm awake, it's awake with me. Sometimes I wonder what will happen when I finally do fall asleep. A real, deep sleep. Will I be free? Or will that be the moment the door to my own mind finally opens? And it's allowed to step out of the shadows and into the world. For good? I don't know. And that's why, every night, I check the locks on my door. I wedge a chair under the handle. And I do my best to stay awake.